Welcome to Aging Wisely, the podcast, a show that aims to center the lives and needs of the aging and disabled communities, a platform for the issues that matter to them most, a space for them and those who work with and alongside them. I am Veronica Escobar, the producer and host. My goal is to educate and transform. This week, you're going to meet and hear from Catherine Yeoh, or as she is also called, Katie. I learned so much about Katie, her dreams, the ABLE Ensemble, and all of the elements that make it and their performers extraordinary. You will absolutely come away with knowledge, but also a deeper respect for people who have cognitive and developmental disabilities and what they can achieve. If you've been listening to the podcast since its very recent beginning, and in particular, the podcast in Español, in Spanish, then you've already met Marcela and heard the story of her brother, Sebastián. He has Down syndrome. She's also responsible for introducing me to this next guest. Diversity and inclusion have become very hot topics lately. We often hear about it in the context of education, the workplace, and in the arts. What we don't often speak about is the inclusion of people with disabilities in the performing arts, especially those with cognitive and developmental disabilities. Enter Katie Yeoh. She's currently based in Chicago, Illinois, but her roots are in the Keystone State, Pennsylvania. Her love of the arts, especially performance, began there too, at a very early age. She is the founder of the ABLE Ensemble, a performing arts nonprofit. The members are teenagers and young adults. As I like to do in every interview, I'll let Katie introduce herself. You could say she was destined for ABLE.
I would memorize movies and perform them for myself. I would do The Wizard of Oz. We had a dog that was a Karen Terrier. She would be Toto and I would be everybody else. I always loved that. So my parents enrolled me in a show choir when I was in middle school. And that was when it really started to come out. So we would go perform at nursing homes and we'd go to hospital wings and veterans hospitals on the weekends and sing, and then also do public performances. And I just loved singing. So that was great. And then that turned into, we'll do the musical at school because you like singing, so might as well do musical theater. And then that turned into, oh, you actually really love Shakespeare, and because there is such a musicality to that as well. So that all kind of came early. But I always had, I don't know, I just feel like I always kind of had that natural performer instinct a little bit.
When I asked her if she was a theater geek, she readily and proudly owned it.
Oh, for sure. 100%. It's where, for me, that's where everything congregated. That's where my best friends were. That's where I was the most comfortable. I did well academically, but I really only did it because I knew I needed to keep my grades up if I wanted to be able to participate in the theater. That was my motivation for everything.
Katie's love of performance eventually led her to Syracuse University with hopes of musical theater and the bright lights of Broadway. In what she calls the first of many humbling experiences in her college BFA program, she wasn't accepted into the musical theater program. She was, however, accepted into acting. Her confidence took a hit during those years, being amongst other really talented young people. But that wasn't the most significant experience at Syracuse.
I think the seed of ABLE started there. We had and there still is this program there at Syracuse now it's called All-Star Cast. It was called Young Actors Workshop while I was there. But undergraduate theater students would partner with individuals from the community with disabilities, and we would put on shows. So we'd rehearse every Monday night because the theaters were dark on Monday nights. And then we'd make our own shows or stage our own thing at the end of every semester. And that became the more, in retrospect, the way more valuable piece of my bachelor's experience for me. It was just a really important part of my education.
Did you know as a 19, 20, 21-year-old that you were going to be working with individuals with disabilities? Or at that time, was it just this really cool experience that left its mark on you?
The latter. The show choir that I mentioned before, we would sing once a year, every year at a home called Melmark, which is a group living facility for individuals with disabilities. And that was always my favorite performance of the year. I loved that show because we would sing for them, but then they would sing for us. They have an awesome handbell choir. They're called the Joy Bells. They would play for us. So I loved that. So when I found out Syracuse had that opportunity, I was like, oh, that'll be cool. Like, I've done stuff like that. I know what that's about. So it was more just something fun to do.
But it turned out to be more profound than this for Katie.
And then as school went on, and it was like, you get so bogged down in auditioning and, is your body right? And all of this subjective stuff that has nothing to do with how talented you are, has nothing to do with what kind of a human you are. I valued my time in that room just infinitely more than anything else that was happening because I always felt good in that room. And I didn't always feel good in my other rehearsal rooms. So it started to plant the seeds there.
After college, Katie spent time in London in Syracuse's study abroad program and worked in London's theater community. She then made her way to Chicago, still determined to work in theater, hoping that if she did well enough, she could make her way to New York. Life had other plans, though. You said earlier that when you were at Syracuse, you had never thought of working with disabled people in the arts as a possible career, but it's what you're doing now. So what happened when you were in Chicago where the light bulb went on and you're like, well, I guess this is it for me?
I'll give you like the medium length version of this.
Tell me the best version of it. I don't care if it's long.
I was in a show that I was not proud of. It was the kind of show that you're in to like not have a gap in your performing resume, but like you don't invite your family and your friends to come and see. And I got hurt real bad in final dress rehearsal. I fell from a 12-foot platform and I cracked my collarbone in half.
She literally fell on her back, but it was a turning point.
That was a, hey, stop and take stock of your life kind of a moment. And why are you hurting yourself and almost killing yourself for something that you're not proud of? So I had backed off from auditioning and I wasn't really doing much.
I always say that the best things will often come out of left field and sometimes at our low points. This was true for Katie.
But a friend who was in that show volunteered for an organization called Gigi's Playhouse. There are multiple playhouses all over the country. There's some in Mexico and Canada. They're a community center for individuals with Down syndrome and their families. So Mallory was volunteering there and put this call out on Facebook and was like, I think I bit off more than I could chew and said that I would start a theater program for a bunch of kids with Down syndrome, and I don't know what I'm doing. Does anybody want to help me? And I was like, I actually do know how to do that because I'd done it at Syracuse.
At Gigi's Playhouse, she not only found a creative outlet, but it was the beginning of a new chapter.
Yeah, let's go. She and I, as two volunteers, started this weekly drama club. In the beginning, we had 6 kids who were 13, 14-ish years old. And we'd meet every Friday night and start just playing theater games and exploring the theater world together. And that is what morphed into what has now become ABLE. Those original 6 actors are all now still with ABLE and they're in their 20s. And so it kind of started there. And it seemed like the right way for all of what I like and what I feel good at to kind of converge together, and a way to stay attached to the theater community, but without the stuff that my heart about it. There's stuff that's so hard and you hear no so many times, and you're to this or you're not enough that, and it's just such a hard world to be in. And instead we got to be in a space where it was like, yeah, man, anything goes. Let's play. Like, let's just do it. And we would figure stuff out and make it work. Anything that came up, we could make work.
I think this statement sums up why Katie lives the best of both worlds.
It's getting to do all the fun stuff that I love about the theater without the nasty bits.
3 years into her time as a volunteer at Gigi's Playhouse, the theater program she helped to run grew. She saw the potential and decided to start an independent theater program. This would become ABLE. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit because you've mentioned the word ABLE a couple of times, and I want to sort of, how did the name ABLE come to be?
ABLE stands for Artists Breaking Limits and Expectations. That's who we are. We're artists. We're not necessarily just actors, right? We love dance and we love music, and we've got some very talented visual artists in our ensemble as well. And we are working as an organization to make a place where everyone is able. The core belief, right, is that everyone is able to connect, to contribute, and to create. And more importantly, that everyone deserves to connect, to contribute, and to create. But we live in a society where there are still a lot of misperceptions and stereotypes and stigma against what it means to have a disability. So we are also trying to break some of those limits and some of those expectations about who deserves to be on stage, who can be on stage, what that needs to look like, how that needs to work. We're trying to bust through some of that, some of those misperceptions, and hopefully making our communities a little more inclusive as a result.
But just as ABLE was getting off the ground, Katie made a decision.
I just didn't feel like I had enough grounding to take it to the next level. I need to be as on top of the programming and education side of things as I possibly can, because that's what I can bring to the table. So I went to pursue my master's in applied theater to get just a really good, solid underpinning of why we were doing the work that we were doing and the educational theories underpinning the work that we're doing.
She moved to London to begin a master's in applied theater at the Royal Central School for Speech and Drama at the University of London.
Applied theater is the practice of using theater with communities who would not necessarily be doing theater. And it's just about making theater together. So I have colleagues from my master's degree who work within the criminal justice system. I have colleagues who are working with immigrant populations or doing theater as a way of teaching like English as a second language. I have colleagues who've worked in orphanages and schools, all with this sort of mindset that we can learn some stuff from making theater together, and that the experience of collaborating in that way can help us to be better people.
How is an applied theater program different? Is it more about pedagogy?
Yes. So we're thinking about theater as a practice, right? There's less time where we're like, let's make a play and do your like breath exercises. And, you know, there's less of that training. And it's more about, what are the theories underpinning a theatrical education? We look a lot at co-intentional pedagogy and ways that we can structure our rooms to be as supportive as possible for individuals who may be coming from all different backgrounds. And then we're also looking at a lot of different societal contexts, because I think the basis of applied theater is that you're going to be working with some marginalized population. You're working with some people who are not, for one reason or another, they're not getting opportunity in society to be a creative person. So we're also looking at some of those lived experiences and really trying to understand some social and political contexts for how people have to live in this world. And so it's humbling yourself a little bit, learning how to situate yourself in the world, and just getting a better respect for the world that people are living in.
So once you received the education that you intentionally sought out, when you came back to Chicago, how did ABLE change?
ABLE has gotten a lot bigger. I've always worked hard to respond to our community. Biggest change that happened right when I came back was in our adult program. So when an individual turns 22, they lose a lot. In the disability world, you lose your access to public schooling, which for a lot of individuals is their like only social connection. They also lose access to some benefits and some services. It's when you're an adult then legally in the eyes of the law. And so a lot changes for an individual with disabilities at that time. It's heartbreaking. And then you also see an increase in likelihood of depression, of mental health issues, as a result of that kind of isolation. Like nobody wants that. We need to keep going. We need to build another branch of programming that is to support these families and these individuals because they need it a little bit more. The other big piece that grew out of that was internally a lot more focus on how we are training our teaching artists and our volunteers who work with us and what kind of support we're giving them. And then I think just the ambition shifted a little bit for me, right? I had been prior to my master's, it was, I am a Pilates instructor and I run this fun program. And now it is, no, this is my full-time focus. And well, it's not officially full-time yet because funding, but this is my focus and this is what I do. So I think just as a person, the difference is like if you met me at a party, I'm going to introduce myself as the executive director of ABLE and not as a fitness instructor.
Now, for those who are listening to this and have no idea how ABLE is structured, tell me about ABLE's programming.
ABLE engages learners 14 and up, with obviously a little bit more focus on the adult population through 3 branches of programming. So our core program, our ensemble, and work with, that's a group of up to 10 actors with varying disabilities, working with a pair of teaching artists and a team of volunteer facilitators to create theater or film project. But they are working together as an ensemble to create some sort of final project over the course of a 12-week semester. But it's all geared towards letting the ensemble share their own voices and also to claim ownership over that performance experience and making sure that they're able to stand in the spotlight. Then we also have our workshop program. And our workshops are one-off experiences that are geared around a specific performance techniques. And our workshops are great because they allow us to welcome in more individuals. We'd love to have many, many ensembles, and right now we only have 4 of them. So there are people on our wait list who want to be involved. And then part 3 is our outreach program, and that's when we go off to schools or community organizations or other groups that serve individuals with developmental disabilities, either to run workshops or a residency, like a longer term program for their participants, or to do professional development training for their staff.
Those are some branches. I'm sitting here listening to you and I feel tired. I feel very tired because it's a lot. You have 4 ensembles, you have seasonal workshops, but you're also going out into your local community and teaching people who service the same communities that you work with about how to be better and how to better address the needs of that same population. After all of these years and the ups and downs, Katie's dream actually came true.
I've done stuff that I wanted to do, stuff that young me said that she wanted to do. It just looks now very different than I thought it was going to look, right? Like I moved to Chicago as a professional actor thinking the biggest stage you can perform on in the city is at Chicago Shakespeare Theater at Navy Pier. And as someone who says she wants to be a classical actor, that is my goal. I want to perform at Chicago Shakespeare Theater at Navy Pier. And I've done that like 5 times, but not in the way that I ever thought I was going to. I've done it standing behind one of our ensemble members and helping them be Viola and helping them be Kate and helping them be Rosalind and these incredible characters on a classical stage. It's been a very different path to the stuff that I thought I wanted.
I was fortunate enough to be introduced to you by a member of your board who also happens to be somebody that I know and that I interviewed for another episode of this podcast. She became a board member because her brother has Down syndrome. And so this is a personal thing for her. And I first became aware of Able because she was promoting it on social media. And when I saw it, I just became immediately intrigued by what you were doing without ever having spoken to you and obviously never having seen a performance. And so I hit the follow button and you were kind enough to acquiesce to my request to be on this podcast. So the thing that struck me when I was able to watch the performances online when you did the anthology series was the people that you work with. I mean, the actors, the young people blow me away, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but it's the people that you work with. It's the team, it's the facilitators and those teaching artists. So I want to spend some time talking about the people that give of their time to work with this community. They deserve some time on this podcast as well. So tell me about your team.
My team's awesome. So we have a great team. We've each of our ensembles is anchored by 2 teaching artists. So right now we have a roster of 8 teaching artists. I am one. Those teaching artists are responsible for helping shape curriculum or directing whatever final show you're going to see. So you can see our actors' personalities in that story, but you can also really see the teaching artist in each story and how the teaching artist shaped that piece. And our teaching artists come from a lot of backgrounds. Some of them are educators, some of them are artists who work as performing artists in different formats. Some of them are professional teaching artists. Like then we have our volunteer facilitators, and there's usually, we try to keep a 2-to-1 ratio of actors to support in our rehearsal space. And our facilitators are similarly from all different backgrounds, personally and professionally, and they volunteer their time. Our core facilitators come every week. Our rotating facilitators come usually at least like half of the semester to model exercises, to give additional support and coaching to actors who need it in rehearsal. Our facilitators are amazing people.
Now, your facilitators, do they come from a theater arts background, or are they just people who want to help?
The above. Some have theater backgrounds and are actively pursuing theatrical careers and are incredibly, incredibly talented people. Some of them are educators. Some of them are lawyers. We had for a long time Yay to the lawyers. For a long time we had a pilot. At some point, all of us have been touched by what the performing arts can do. We are a group of people who want to share that joy and to share that connection with other people. It's a very supportive, kind, smart group of humans on our teaching team, and they're like nothing else.
Now let's get to the main attraction, the stars of all this, the participants in Able. Who are they?
Currently in the ensemble, 38 actors, ages 15 to 37, with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, autism, all varying intellectual and developmental disabilities, personalities and sets of abilities and needs and strengths and interests. And it's a great time. They're great friends.
Now, you mentioned people who come from great distances to participate when the program was in person and live. The fact that a family would drive 30 miles to bring their loved one to a rehearsal says a lot. What does it tell you?
I mean, it sounds like a pat on the back for us, right? That we're great and we're doing something special. But I think more it tells me that there are so few valuable opportunities that someone is willing to go through. And especially like if you've got an autistic child, like a 30-mile car ride sucks. Like there's, that's a lot of sensory stuff to be going that far from home to have to look for something that will accept you. So I love everyone who is part of our ensemble, and I'm grateful that we have so many people from all over, but it does also frustrate me to think that there aren't opportunities for them closer to home.
When you run a nonprofits, they survive and thrive based not only on private donations and grants, but also money or stipends from government entities. And it's an everyday thing to stay afloat and to grow. And to do development work in the nonprofit sector is a job. It is a job. So, what is the state of the arts for those with developmental disabilities? Because I know that you're connected to other groups, not only in Illinois, but throughout the United States. So, when you guys get together and talk about the state of things, what are the state of things?
I think we're trying. I think we will see more theaters now trying, at least from the audience side, to understand that accessibility matters and we need to make our theaters more welcoming for individuals with disabilities as audience members. Where we struggle is in the representation side and seeing performers with disabilities on our stages and on our screens. And it's a couple years old now. The Rudderman Family Foundation did a study that looked at television and streaming services, and they looked at all of the shows across all of those platforms, and it was something like 2% of characters were written as having a disability, and of those very small amount of characters, like 95% of the roles for a person with a disability went to a typically abled actor.
Because the last person, and I'm aging myself here right now, the last person that I remember who had Down syndrome, who had a starring role on a TV show was Corky on Life Goes On, Chris Burke. That was back in the 90s, and I was a kid back then. And in terms of what you were talking about before, where you see people who are more typically able than not, I don't know if you saw Oklahoma on Broadway in New York. I had the fortune of seeing it. Ali Stryker is one of the most amazing actors I've ever seen. And her voice, and I'll say it, the ability to maneuver that wheelchair on that stage.
But here's the thing. She was nominated for and won a Tony Award, and the Tonys couldn't build a ramp for her to get up on the stage. She had to sit backstage when her category was called. So, like, we still have a long way to go. So we are not including these individuals in a valuable way on our stages and on our screens, backstage in the writers' rooms or in positions of power on a set. And so because of that lack of representation, then I think we see a lot of confusion about what it means to have a disability, what someone with a disability is able to do, what someone with a disability is like, what it means to have autism or what it means to have Down syndrome. We'll see very stereotypical representations of these conditions without it being a well-rounded presentation. So I think the acknowledgement is there that representation matters, but we still have a long way to go towards that.
Fortunately, Able has friends all across the country.
We've got friends in New York, Collab Theater in New York. We've got friends at Pink Umbrella in Milwaukee. We've got Open Spot, which is branching out now from, they were in Metro Detroit and now they're branching out to different places around the country. There are companies that are trying. I think a lot of companies haven't figured out, though, how to include the full spectrum of individuals with all different abilities. And that's what I think is special about an Able performance, is that we are, I don't care if you're a verbal communicator or if you're not, like, there is a place for you on stage. And I think a lot of times when you see someone with a disability included in a show, they're still going to favor the more typically abled performer. It still is, can you memorize your lines? Can you handle this big monologue? Can you clearly articulate this solo? And I don't care about any of that. As a director, I'm trying to make space for everyone to be able to be up there. And that's where I think we're suffering, because I think we're not including enough people with disabilities in the creative process to really understand to get a better sense of how big the spectrum is and how much thinking we need to be doing.
Let's talk about ableism. And I think you're the perfect person to talk about it, or one of the better people. You're better at it than me. So let's talk about that.
We have so much internalized ableism as a society that I think we're not even good at recognizing it when we're doing it. And that I think lends itself to the funding opportunities that we would get, right? People want a tragedy narrative around disability, or they want to invest in what the disability community would call inspiration porn, which is a phrase that's was coined by an activist named Stella Young. But it's basically like, disabled people exist as to inspire you as a typically abled person to live a better, more appreciative, more well-rounded life. So you'll see the memes of like the girl with the prosthetic legs running, and there's a caption that's like, "What's your excuse? Get out there and do it." But, or like, you know, ooh, he took the girl with Down syndrome to prom. What a gentleman. And it's using these disabled people in a way that they only exist if they make us feel better about ourselves, which is so messed up. And it doesn't value the full experience of what it means to be disabled. And I work with a lot of people with Down syndrome. So the one that I'll get all the time is, they're so loving and they're so happy all the time. You must have so much fun. And it's like, no, we got to step back and value this as an individual with the full range of human emotions. Or like, I work with teenagers who are hormonal, all crying and crushing and falling in love with each other. And it's all over our society. So what becomes troublesome, right, then is like in applying for funding is that if you're not willing, like I'm not willing to pimp my actors out in that way to be, and I have the stories, I can tell the stories of the boy who didn't talk until he was, 3 months into rehearsal with us, or the girl who wouldn't pick her head up and then suddenly did the monologue center stage. Like I have those stories, but should it matter? Should it matter that he talked or didn't talk? Should it matter that she's not a verbal communicator and she likes to use her iPad to touch chat to communicate? Like that shouldn't matter. But we feed these narratives. And then I think to come back to the earlier conversation, in Hollywood, you don't have a ton of disabled actors to begin with. Certainly don't have a ton of disabled writers. So there's nobody to check us in the stories that we're putting out there. So the opportunities that are getting put out there are perpetuating some of these stereotypes.
So I actually kind of want to jump back into it because you were talking about something that I think it's important, and I wanted to talk about how it applies to your work. When you meet one person with autism, you just met one person with autism, and you talked about how some of them are averse to stimulus and others of them are attracted to stimulus and they'll go towards it. So when you're working in ABLE and you have all of these ensemble participants who are on the spectrum, and when I use the word spectrum, I'm not just talking about autism, I'm talking about the spectrum. And I want to talk about that for a second, because a lot of people who work in the autism advocacy world, they kind of move away a little bit from talking about a spectrum.
It's not a linear spectrum. I think of it like a pie or like a circle. I might be like towards the border on speech and communication, but right in towards the center of the circle on something else. There is a range of abilities and needs and strengths and interests for everyone that we work with. And so we try to support all of these learning styles in rehearsal as much as we can. And we do that with some tools. The biggest tool we have is just our teaching team. So we try to keep a 2-to-1 ratio of our teaching team so that there's always somebody who can go do one-to-one work with someone if needed, or do quiet side coaching if somebody needs that, or to say like, you know what, he just needs a break. We're going to go sit in the hallway and take a couple deep breaths and drink some water, and then we'll come back in. Somebody who can kind of help mitigate that way. What I think our facilitators are brilliant at is demonstrating participation and just modeling what we are looking. This is what we're looking for. If you're not sure what to do, watch Claire. They'll show you what to do. But then we have other strategies too. We have, visual aids, and we have a sensory box as appealing to as many learning styles as possible.
So your team, as much as they come from different backgrounds, they have to be adept and in tune with a lot of different types of people. And that's a challenge.
We come from different backgrounds, but we're unified in wanting to be there. And I think the longer you're with us, then too, right, the better you get at, because your relationships get deeper. So you know faster what accommodations someone needs, or you can say, I've seen this behavior before. I know what this behavior means from this person. Any behavior is communication in its own way. So we have strategies for our teaching team too, which is, we have profiles on our actors. We've got kind of like one pagers of each ensemble member that is, how long have they been with us? Who are people in their life that they might talk about? You're going to hear about Chloe. Chloe is this person's cat. It's not their sister. You're going to hear, who are you going to hear them talk about? What is going to light this person up? What is going to really frustrate them? What are some of the strategies we use if they are dysregulating and we do need to help them come back into the room with us? How do they perform best on stage? What kind of support do they need on stage? What kind of roles do they like? And over time, we can really build that profile up about a person. So we are, we get a shorthand about certain people.
Now, when I was watching the anthology series, and for people that are listening, the anthology series is basically, for me, it was a series of 8 stories, and there were 2 stories every night. And the participants were part of the story. And from what I could gather, there were elements of their own lives in these stories. How did that come about?
We do a mix of performances at Able, but our favorites are always our devised shows where we write and create them ourselves. This semester worked with, in the first half of the term, had guest artists coming from all over the world to share myths with us. And we really unpacked the elements of a story, right? A story has a theme, a story has characters, a setting, a plot. And then in the second half of the semester, we devised and created our own stories. Why I say they're some of our favorites is because you will see the hearts and minds of the ensemble in the devised shows, because it's whatever is in their heart at that time, at the time we're creating, is what comes out on stage. So we started by picking a theme, and then we created characters, and we'd ask questions to the ensemble, and they would pick answers. And as they answered the questions about the character, our facilitators would throw up images or words or pictures so we could create this kind of collage of who this character was. We'd start to answer these questions, and then stories kind of take shape around these people that we create, or these characters that we create. They're not all people.
And I want to talk about that because you've actually tackled classics like Shakespeare. And I did a Shakespeare. Well, I'll tell you about my theater experience. I played the Lorax once in a Dr. Seuss play. I did. And I got good reviews. But I also played Lady Macbeth. Shakespearean English, that's not easy.
Shakespeare's challenging and there's no way around it. But what's great about Shakespeare is that it's big. The emotions are big. The characters are big. There's not a ton of subtext. If you think something, you say it. So in terms of like the emotional literacy side of things, there's some great, wonderful, teachable stuff to explore. But also as a producer, Shakespeare carries tremendous cultural cachet, right? Like that is considered an elite thing. Elite actors do Shakespeare. And so I think we are giving ownership over these stories that have not in yes. And then, also get the criticism that's like, everybody's like, we've seen Shakespeare before and we're over it. Do we really need to see another
Shakespeare quite like this?
Exactly. Like how many times in 400 odd years have you seen 20 actors with Down syndrome doing Twelfth Night? You haven't. And so we're giving them ownership over these stories that do belong to them, that can belong to them. We're showing that We respect them. I respect their talents. I respect their right to perform this. And I'm also challenging my audience to rethink not only what they expect, right? Artists breaking limits and expectations. What do you expect from this group of people with disabilities? But also, like, what do you expect from Shakespeare? Like, who do you think Shakespeare is for? Who do you think the theater is for? Who do you think this artistic experience is for? The answer is it's for everyone.
But the theater itself, and you probably coming from this background know it, but it's elitist. And I'll tell you just a story because I'm thinking about it. I like going to the theater. I love Broadway. I love the opera, and I like classical music, the Philharmonic. And when you're in the theater physically, if you're in the Met Opera House, you don't see a lot of diversity in terms of who's sitting in the audience. And I remember once, and I'll never forget it, I'm there at the Met. It's an opera, don't remember which one. And it was a group of school children, and they were all Latino or Black, and they were coming in with their teacher. This was a nighttime performance. They just kind of stuck out, and people were looking at them, you know what I mean? Because nobody really expected them to be there. But I was heartened by their presence, because why shouldn't they be there?
Why shouldn't they be there? But also, I wonder how they felt, right? Because did they see themselves reflected back to them on that stage, right? Like, are they seeing Black and brown faces looking back at them? We have work to do on both sides of the theatrical experience. And I think that's what's frustrating from a producer's standpoint, is that we don't have our own space. We're an itinerant company. So we will partner with a different theater for every show that we're doing based on our production calendar, their production calendar. When can we match up? But what's great is that then I get to have this type of conversation with every single theater that we're in. And I get to say things like, do you have a social story? Why don't you have a social story for your space? Can we help you make a social story so that audiences feel welcomed coming to your theater? Has your technical team done a relaxed performance before? Can we talk about where the lighting levels need to be to make this feel like the best and most welcoming experience for our performers on stage? We get to have that conversation and get them thinking a little bit differently about who belongs on that stage. And I mean, I'll be honest, there are spaces in Chicago, especially because there's so many storefront theaters, that we can't work in because they're just not accessible.
I think it's about creating spaces for people who don't have spaces in the theater. And it's about normalizing, because it should be, about normalizing their presence in the theater, not only as spectators, but as participants.
And that's what comes back to the earlier conversation, right? Of like the things that we need to do to make our spaces and our places more accessible. It costs money, and you've got to want to do it, and you've got to want to put the investment in to make it happen. But we've got to get to a point where it's not just like a fun bonus thing that we're doing one relaxed performance out of the run of this show, one show in our season, but that it's a constant thing that we are thinking about, planning for, and making a conscious effort to do. And once that becomes part of the zeitgeist in that way, then I think we'll start to see some real changes.
Diversity is inviting somebody to the dance. Inclusion is asking them to dance. So there's a difference between promoting diversity, and it's another thing to make room at your table for someone who's never been invited.
This is the thing. Accessibility is not like a magic trick. And I'll hear that a lot, where I think any of us who do this work will get the like pats on the back where it's like, you're such a special person. It takes an angel to do this kind of work. And I'm like, I'm no more special than any other
I
job.
think you're special. I do.
Thank you. But like, I think you're special. You have an educational background that I don't have. And like, I would not have pursued law. I think my veterinarian is special, right? Like that's a skill set that I wouldn't have necessarily, that I couldn't have pursued because I would have probably cried all day. But like, it's not a magic trick to create accessibility. It takes planning. It takes forethought. It takes a want. You have to want to do it. But the things that we need to make our spaces and our places and our creative experiences more accessible for individuals, they're not impossible. You just need someone who's willing to put in the time. And I think more importantly, with the performing arts industry, the money to make the changes that you need to make.
You're growing. And I think it's a natural extension of everything that you're doing.
Everything has been organic. Our next step has always felt very obvious, but I think that that's because we try really hard to listen to the community that we are working with. And that's really at the micro level and at the macro level, right? That's what I'm doing in class. I'm looking at this person and thinking, what does this person need to be successful? And what are they asking for? And what can we do in this room to make this person succeed right now? But also, what does this community need from us as an organization, and what do we do to help them meet those goals in the next stage? That's how we grew the adult program. It's now why we're talking about the Supporting Artist Initiative. It's why we became an organization, right? Instead of staying as a little volunteer program.
It's your destiny. I think that everything that's happened in your life, every rejection, every time where you felt a crushing disappointment, because I'll join that club. We all have gone through those situations. They all redirect us to where we need to be.
I have lasting nerve damage in my left arm. I have to be very diligent about doing my PT exercises. And I am, 11 years out from this, 12 years out from this injury. Like, I have to be very careful, but breaking my collarbone was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I wouldn't have gone on the path in many, many ways. I met my husband because I had broken my collarbone. I was sad and mopey and feeling sorry for myself. And a friend said, I'm going to fix you up on a blind date. And I was like, whatever. Cause I was like, I don't care. Who cares? Whatever. Nothing worse is going to happen to me. And I married him. So like.
Then you married the nothing worse is going to happen to me. Ever so off topic, I told Katie how wonderful I thought it was that she found her husband in this way. It was such a lighthearted moment. Stepping away from romance, however, let's get back to Able. In the 10 years or so, how many years has Able been up?
Able has been able for just under 5 years. We'll turn 5 in May of 2021. But the program at Gigi's started in 2010.
Because when I was watching the anthology series, I know that there are a couple of participants there who have been with you. They've been with the Playhouse or with Able for 10 years.
With one exception, because his family moved, our entire cast of Romeo and Juliet is still with us.
Which is a feat, because even people at places of employment, many people don't even last a year or two. So the fact that you've been able to keep your performers for a decade says a lot about them, but also about the families. And this is a question that I wanted to get to. What have the performers taught you about yourself?
Well, we talked about asking for help. We talked about, I think that's the big one, right? Ask if you need something. They're not shy about that. Slowing down, I think, is a big one. I tend to be in my own life and with myself very impatient. And I have my mentor, so the professor at Syracuse who actually started All-Star Cast, the program that I was in at Syracuse that kind of inspired the work that we do at Able. I was a senior and I was just struggling with a piece in her class. And she very quietly pulled me to a corner and she said, you are not allowed to talk to yourself any differently than you talk to the participants on Monday nights. And I'm still working on that, but just giving time and space and patience, I think, is a big thing. I mean, our community is the most incredible thing. Our community, like the importance of our community and bonding with our community, relationships are so important. And being able to rely on each other and support each other and cheer for each other is brilliant. Something that I love that we'll talk a lot about as teaching artists is when we watch performances back, our actors are so unabashedly proud of themselves. Like there is just not even a hesitation of, I was awesome. We ended one of the anthology live streams. It was the Friday night one. It was the first one that we did. And the first words out of, I said, okay, actors, we're clear. Live stream's over. And Maria just goes, that was perfect for me. Just like, they are so unabashedly proud of each other, cheering each other on. That is such a spectacular thing. And I struggle with, like, if I watch myself perform, I am constantly like, you could have done that better. You should have done this differently. You could have done, XYZ. Oh, look at your eyebrows. Look at your, I'm so critical of myself. And to be in an environment where that's just not allowed is so great. It's so spectacular.
Now, you just touched upon something else, the families, the parents. What have they ever told you about what Able has done for them? Because I know what it does, and I can only imagine what it does for your performers and how it makes them feel. What does it do for the parents? Because if I'm going to talk about heroes, if I'm going to talk about warriors, that's the parents.
Like a break, a 90-minute break in the week to be like, you know what, we've got your person and they're in good hands and we'll take care of them. A lot of the families would go out together. Like we'd be in rehearsal and they would go to the bar around the corner, or they'd go to the Mexican restaurant and like they'd have dinner together, they have drinks together. It's an opportunity for them to bond as a community too, and then they can help each other. We are as much a space for the whole family as we are for an actor. My favorite comments are the ones where it's something like, I never saw him do that before, or I never saw that side of them before. We are giving time where they are autonomous. The performance that ends up on stage is bringing out something different than what would be happening if mom was sitting right next to them. They want that space and that independence and that agency, which is such an important part of what we're doing. And then I think also for the parents to see that that is possible. Because I think there's a lot of worry as a parent too, right? Of like, what is going to happen to my person and how are people going to respond to my person and care for my person? Nothing really comes to life with Able until you get to see us perform in whatever type of performance is. You can think you understand what we're doing and you don't really get it until you see a show. And I will include families in that too. Like if we have a new actor join us, we can't really get their parent on board with us until they've seen their first show.
You alluded to it before that you have a maximum amount of performers that you can have in the program, and there isn't a lot of turnover. So what is the selection process for a Able member or an ensemble member? And where do you, I don't want to use the word poach, but yeah, where do you poach? Where do you find these young people?
For the most part, we have grown completely through word of mouth. It's been one family saying to another family, yo, you've got to get involved in this because it's been really great for Emily, or it's been really great for Jack, or, you know, our family has had a great time and you should get involved. That's usually how people find us. We have had since the beginning of our time as a nonprofit a wait list, and that wait list exists just strictly from just a capacity standpoint. Like I work full-time elsewhere. My program coordinator also works a full-time job. We are limited in what we can do. And any family you bring into the ensemble, that's administrative time. There's registration time. There's the time getting to know the family. There's all of that. So we have space in each ensemble for 10 actors. My mindset is once you are with us, there is a space for you forever, especially since we started the adult program. We will be a constant thing that you don't need to worry about losing. And then honestly, the wait list is first come, first served. Whoever asked first, if there's an opportunity open, we reach out to them. We give them a window to say, you've got to let us know in the next week. And if you don't let us know, we're going to throw it to the next person on the list. And it goes from there. But there is no audition process to be a part of Able. You just need to want to be there. And if you want to be there, we will make a space for you.
Now, I know that you've probably trained a lot of performers in the last decade and that you don't necessarily want to play favorites, but is there one performer in the last decade that left their mark on you, and why?
I can tell you a story about everyone. I can tell you how they were when they started with us. I can tell you what they're working on. I can tell you what successes we've had. I can tell you when they joined us, what characters they've played. Because everybody does have a story. It's hard to play favorites. You develop friendships. And just like with any group of people, there are people that you have some things in common with more than others. Alina's really special, and I have a really soft spot for Alina. When we're in performance, we do something we call dropping in. So each actor is partnered with a teaching artist or a facilitator who helps to drop in their lines. I can feed that line to the actor, and the actor gets to repeat it back with as much life and personality as they bring to their performance. And it's something that we do so that our actors who maybe struggle with literacy or struggle with short-term memory or who struggle with verbal communication are not left out. And I was I was her first person. And she just wasn't into it. I had to like loop my arm through her arm and physically shepherd her from one place on the stage to the next. And she barely picked her head up and she barely spoke above a whisper. She did it. She said every word, but she barely hear her. And I was standing right next to her. But now, fast forward, when we did our last big main stage show was As You Like It at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, and Alina got a mid-show standing ovation as Jaques for the All the World's a Stage speech because she just owns it. She takes up space and she's booming. Her voice is booming. She's so full of life and she believes that she deserves to be center stage. And so she takes it.
And I wish we all had that attitude.
It's spectacular, but it was hard fought and it took her a long time to get there. But it's just really special to see her journey. And she sits backstage when we're in a theater. Each actor has kind of their own designated chair backstage with their headshot on it and they like hang out. And she sits backstage and just with her eyes closed and rocks back and forth and just chants Beyonce, 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 Beyonce. Because she's just like channeling her Beyonce energy.
Well, Beyonce's channeling her Beyonce because Beyonce in real life is an introvert.
I'm sure, yeah. So no, like Alina just sits and like rocks and channels her Beyonce, and she's really special to me.
I can tell she is because your face lights up when you're talking about her. I mean, I wish the audience could actually see your face, but you light up when you talk about her and you're smiling.
I love her. I love her. She's great. I mean, but I could tell that story or a story about every single actor that we work with, and it's part of the joy of being at it for so long is that I do have a really solid relationship with every ensemble member we have. I get to work with them and get to know them all. So it's really special.
And I'm just going to put it out there. How much money would an organization like yours need to fundraise to add a fifth ensemble?
To add an ensemble would be, including like our staff time and all of that work, we're looking at about $25,000 to add an ensemble per year.
So to run the 4 ensembles that you have, I'm going to take salary and other things out of the equation. To run the 4 ensembles that you have, you need about $100,000 a year, minimum.
And that doesn't cover any of the extras. So that doesn't cover workshops. That doesn't cover outreach. That's just for the ensembles and for a lot of free labor.
As Katie mentioned earlier, Able turns 5 in May of 2021. And as of the date of the original airing of this episode, in honor of their birthday, Able raised over $25,000 to add that 5th ensemble. During our time together, I asked Katie about the future of Able.
What we had talked about was having our own space where we become sort of a hub where teaching artists or people who are interested in being a teaching artist with this population can come and train, where we have our ensembles and our ensembles have a dedicated space to perform. So we're not begging and borrowing stage space 3 times a year, where we can hold our workshop and we get to be a resource for the community who wants these opportunities. And then I think part of that, right, like we have Central Able Hub where it all kind of starts, but then we also have satellite opportunities. So, people can either license a show from us or license a curriculum. They want to be working with this population and they want a script. We have it. We have your 10-week rehearsal plan to help you do it. Or maybe there's Able, I'm going to say Phoenix because I know we have a family in Phoenix that wants one so badly, that there's Able Phoenix and there's Able LA and there's Able Seattle and little Ables everywhere.
I think that for all of us, but especially for Katie Yo and her entire Able family, this is the ultimate dream and the best way to end this episode.
What the bigger dream would be, and the bigger dream long term, is that we don't need to be there, that there are enough opportunities, and it is such a normalized thing to have people with disabilities included in the theater and in the performing arts that they don't need us as their only way in. I want to become so good that we make ourselves irrelevant.
As always, I want to thank my guest for her time, expertise, commitment, and passion. What an honor it was to not only produce this episode, but to bring it to you. Like Katie, I also hope that one day people with disabilities will have equal participation in every sector of our society. Until then, support people like her and organizations like ABLE in their fight. To learn more, please go to ableEnsemble.com. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Aging Wisely, the podcast. As always, I would like to acknowledge Adam Galchis and his family band, The Waffles, for my theme music, and Sonorous Lab for their sound design and engineering. If you like my podcast, please subscribe. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora, or if you spend time on YouTube, the podcast has a channel by the same name where you can find the episodes. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, you can go to agingwiselypodcast.com and look around. Listen to this and prior episodes, and even better, subscribe to my newsletter. Every 2 weeks, the current episodes and the transcript straight into your inbox. And if you like this episode, I would love a review on whatever platform you listen. And if you enjoy the podcast or have benefited from it in any way, please let others know about it. I would appreciate it. Join me for another episode in 2 weeks. Bye.